There are places that make people without knowing they are making them. Slab Fork, West Virginia did not set out to produce a songwriter. It did not have the infrastructure for that kind of ambition, no music schools, no recording studios, no industry connections, no pathway that led with any obvious logic from its cold, dusted streets to the stages and studios of the American music world. It was a small town that did what small towns in the Appalachian coalfields did. It worked. It endured, it organized itself around the practical necessities of daily survival, and it built, in the process of doing all of that, exactly the kind of community that the most important songs in the world are made from. Bill Withers left Slab Fork at 17 and never permanently returned. But Slab Fork never left Bill Withers. It was present in everything he wrote, in the specific understanding of human interdependence that shaped "Lean on Me," in the direct, unornamented honesty that made "Ain't No Sunshine" sound like a man telling the truth rather than performing it, in the patient, observational quality of attention that he brought to every song and every lyric and every decision about what to include and what to leave out. The town made the songwriter. And then, one summer morning in 1972, the songs came back. A radio somewhere in Slab Fork played "Lean on Me" for the first time. Someone heard it. Someone recognized the voice. And in the particular, quiet way that important things happen in small communities, not with ceremony, not with organized celebration, but with the spreading of information from one person to the next, the gradual recognition moving through the town like weather, Slab Fork understood that something that had come from inside it had reached the outside world and come back changed. What happened in that town on that day and in the days that followed is a story that history has not recorded in detail. Small towns do not generate press releases. Their important moments do not typically appear in newspapers or on television. They occur in kitchens and on front porches and in the aisles of general stores, in the ordinary conversational spaces where community life actually happens. But they occur, and they matter. And this one mattered in ways that took decades to fully understand. Slab Fork in the early 1940s, when Bill Withers was a child growing up within its boundaries, was a community organized around coal. The mine was the center of economic life, the employer, the organizing principle, the thing that determined the rhythm of days and the shape of families, and the particular texture of a community's relationship with hardship. Men went into the mine, women managed households, children learned from early ages that life required work, and that work was not always safe, and that the people around you were not optional extras, but necessary components of survival. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone. Not in the superficial way of places where people recognize faces without knowing stories, but in the deep, sometimes uncomfortable way of places where the stories are too intertwined to pretend otherwise. You knew your neighbor's difficulties because their difficulties affected your daily life. You helped when you could because the expectation of reciprocal help was one of the few reliable forms of insurance available to people who did not have access to more formal kinds. This was not sentiment. This was economics, the practical arithmetic of communities that survive by pooling resources because individual resources are insufficient. People leaned on each other in Slab Fork not because they were particularly virtuous, but because leaning was the only viable strategy. Bill Withers absorbed this understanding before he had words for it. He watched the way his mother's neighbors appeared with food after difficult weeks. He watched the way men from the mine looked out for each other's families when someone was injured or sick. He watched the specific, unhesitating way that helped move through the community when it was needed, not announced, not performed, simply present because its presence was understood to be necessary. He was 5 years old, 6, 7, 8, watching, absorbing, building the interior understanding of human community that would eventually become the emotional foundation of the most important songs he ever wrote. He did not know he was building anything. He was simply living in Slab Fork, growing up in the specific texture of its daily life, being shaped by forces that would not fully reveal themselves for another 25 years. And then his father died. And the town, in the way of towns like Slab Fork, closed around the family and held them. Clarence Withers died in 1951 when Bill was 13 years old. The loss arrived without warning. The way losses arrive in places where there is no infrastructure for softening them, sudden, complete, leaving a gap in the family's daily life that could not be filled by any of the practical measures available. What filled it instead in the weeks and months that followed was the town. Not through organized charity or formal support systems. Slab Fork had neither the resources nor the bureaucratic structure for those things. Through the ordinary, unremarkable generosity of people who understood that the Withers family now had one less person and would need more from the people around them to compensate. Food appeared on the porch. Neighbors found reasons to stop by. Men from the mine, colleagues of Clarence Withers, checked in on the family with the slightly awkward, deeply genuine care of people who know that presence matters even when they do not have the right words for why they have come. Young Bill watched all of this with the same observational precision he brought to everything. He was 13, old enough to understand what was happening and what it meant, young enough to receive it without the complicated ambivalence that adults bring to being helped. He saw the community organizing itself around a gap. He saw people choosing, without being asked, to give what they had toward filling that gap. He saw in the most concrete and personal terms available to a 13-year-old boy that the claim, "lean on me when you're not strong," was not a sentiment but a description of how people actually lived when they lived well. He would not write the song for another 21 years. But the song was already there, in the specific knowledge that Slab Fork had given him, the knowledge that community was not an abstraction but a practice, that human solidarity was not a feeling but a series of small daily choices made by ordinary people in ordinary circumstances. He carried that knowledge to the Navy and through the Navy, and out the other side into the factory floor in Watts and the apartment where he wrote his songs. He carried it into every recording session and every performance. And when the time came to write, "Lean on Me," when the chord progression arrived and the melody came, and the words organized themselves around the central truth he had always known, what he wrote was not an invention. It was a memory of Slab Fork. The summer of 1972 arrived in Slab Fork the way summer always arrived, slowly, by degrees, the Appalachian hills moving through their seasonal transition with the unhurried pace that characterized everything about that landscape. The coal mine continued its work. The community continued its rhythms. Life in Slab Fork in 1972 was not dramatically different from life in Slab Fork in 1951, when Bill Withers had been a boy watching his community hold his family together after his father died. Some things had changed. The civil rights movement had altered certain conditions in the broader world, though its effects in a small West Virginia coalfield community were filtered through layers of local reality that complicated simple narratives. Young people still left for the cities, for Pittsburgh, for Cleveland, for the California coast, in the ongoing migration that had been emptying Appalachian communities for decades. The specific texture of daily life had shifted in ways that were visible to people inside it and invisible to people outside it. But the fundamental thing had not changed. The community still organized itself around human need. People still leaned on each other. The informal networks of mutual support that had existed when Bill Withers was a child still functioned, still moved through the town with the same unremarkable efficiency, still constituted the most important social infrastructure that Slab Fork possessed. Into this community in the summer of 1972 came a sound from the outside world, a radio in a kitchen, or a general store, or a car parked on the street with its windows down. The specific location has not been preserved by any account, because no one in Slab Fork knew in that moment that the location would matter. The radio played, "Lean on Me," and someone in Slab Fork heard the voice and recognized it. Willie Withers's boy, Clarence's son, the one who went to the Navy, the one who'd been living out in California, the one who had left. Recognition in a small town moves differently than it moves in cities. In a city, a famous person's connection to a neighborhood is a fact, noted, perhaps celebrated locally, but processed individually by people who may never discuss it with each other. In a small town, it is a shared event. The information travels through the community's existing channels, the conversations between neighbors, the gatherings at churches and stores and front porches, and as it travels, it accumulates meaning that individual processing cannot produce. In Slab Fork, the recognition of Bill Withers's voice on the radio did not remain anyone's private knowledge for long. It moved. It reached the people who had known his parents, who had watched him grow up, who remembered him as a stuttering boy sitting on the front steps of his family's house, and as a young man leaving for the Navy with the determined quietness of someone who had decided that the world was larger than Slab Fork and needed to be investigated. It reached the women who had brought food to his mother after Clarence died. It reached the men who had worked in the mine alongside his father. It reached people who had not thought about Bill Withers in years, who had filed him away in the category of people who had left and become part of the larger anonymous world beyond the Appalachian hills. And what these people heard, when they listened to the song that had come back to them from California, was not exactly what the radio stations were playing it as. They were not hearing a hit single by a Grammy-winning artist. They were hearing something more specific and more strange. They were hearing Slab Fork. They were hearing the specific understanding of community that their town had built into a child who had grown up inside it, translated into music and sent out into the world and returned to them through a radio speaker as something that millions of people were calling one of the best songs of the year. They had known this, not the song was new, but the thing the song was made of. The central claim that when you are not strong, you can lean on someone, and that someone will carry you. This was not a discovery for the people of Slab Fork. It was a description of their daily life. There were people in Slab Fork in the summer of 1972 who remembered specific things about Bill Withers that the national press coverage of his Grammy win and chart success did not include. They remembered his stutter, the way words had sometimes escaped him in childhood, the particular determination with which he had kept speaking despite the mechanism that worked against him. They remembered his father, Clarence, and the specific quality of that loss in a community where fathers were the economic anchors of families whose stability was always more fragile than it appeared from the outside. They remembered his mother, Maddie, and the neighbors who had helped her in the years after Clarence died. Some of those neighbors were still alive in 1972. Some of them sat with the radio and heard "Lean on Me," and understood with a clarity that required no musical analysis exactly where the song had come from. It had come from here, from the specific practice of a specific community, from the years of watching people hold each other up, borrowed from Slab Fork and carried west by a boy who had left at 17 and had not forgotten, in all the years since, what home had taught him. There is a particular kind of pride that small communities feel when one of their own achieves something in the larger world. It is different from the pride that individuals feel in personal achievements, more complicated, more mixed, containing elements of genuine celebration alongside a kind of bittersweet acknowledgement that the achievement required leaving. The person who made it could not have made it here. They had to go. And in going, they took something of the place with them, and in the taking, they both honored it and confirmed its insufficiency as a container for what they needed to become. Slab Fork felt something like this in the summer of 1972. Pride in Bill Withers' success, recognition of what the song was made of, and underneath both of those things, the particular quiet emotion of a small community hearing itself described, hearing the thing it had always been, without ceremony or self-consciousness, turned into music that the whole world was singing. Bill Withers himself did not return to Slab Fork often. The demands of a career that had suddenly accelerated. The tours, the recording sessions, the media obligations of being a recognized artist did not leave much room for the kind of extended return that would have allowed him to fully encounter what his music had become in the place that had made him. He sent money when he could. He maintained contact with family members who had remained. He carried the town with him in the way that people carry the places that shape them, not as a conscious project but as a quality of mind, a particular way of seeing the world that had been formed in a specific landscape and did not change when the landscape was left behind. What he would have found, had he returned in the summer of 1972 and walked through the streets of Slab Fork, was a community that was hearing its own understanding of itself played back through a radio speaker. Not the full complexity of what Slab Fork was, no 3-minute song could contain that, but the essential thing, the central practice. The specific knowledge that the town had built into its children through decades of simply living the way it lived. He had taken that knowledge and turned it into a song. The song had gone out into the world and come back as something larger than either of them. Larger than the town that had produced the knowledge, larger than the man who had translated it into music. It had become something that belonged to anyone who found truth in it, which turned out to be almost everyone. But before it belonged to everyone, it had belonged to Slab Fork. Not as a product or an achievement, but as a recognition, the particular intimate recognition of a community hearing itself described by someone who had grown up inside it and had not forgotten, in all the years of distance, what it had taught him. The specific conversations that happened in Slab Fork in the summer of 1972, when "Lean on Me" played on the radio and people recognized the voice and understood where the song had come from. These conversations were not recorded. They happened in the places where ordinary life happened: kitchens, front porches, the short walk between houses in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. They were spoken in the ordinary language of people who are not performing their recognition for an audience, but simply sharing it with the people nearest to them. Someone said, "That's Willie's boy." Someone else said, "I know, I heard it yesterday." Someone said, "I didn't know he could sing like that." Someone said, "You remember how he used to stutter?" And then someone, somewhere in that chain of conversation, said the thing that contained the full weight of the moment: "You hear what he's singing about." You hear what he's singing about, because what Bill Withers was singing about was them. Not by name, not with the specific details that would have made the connection obvious to outsiders, but in the way that the deepest songs are about their origins, through the understanding that shaped them, the specific knowledge of human community that could only have come from living inside a specific human community, the translation of one town's daily practice into a truth that the whole world recognized as its own. Slab Fork had made the song. Not in the sense of writing it, Bill Withers had written it, alone, in an apartment in Watts, but in the deeper sense of providing the material from which it was made, the years of watching people hold each other up, the specific knowledge of what human solidarity actually looked like when it was practiced rather than preached, The understanding that "lean on me when you're not strong" was not a lyric but a description of life as Slab Fork had always lived it. The town heard its own song on the radio in the summer of 1972. It did not fully know what to do with that. Small towns rarely do, when the things that shaped them return from the world, transformed into something larger than they were when they left. But they recognized it. In the particular, private, unhurried way of communities that have been described by someone who knew them from the inside, they heard the song and knew it was theirs. And in knowing that, they understood something that the charts and the Grammy and the radio play could not convey, that the most important things a place gives its children are not resources or opportunities or connections. They are understandings, ways of seeing. The specific knowledge of what it means to be human in community, built into a child through the daily practice of a place that did not know it was teaching anything, because it was simply living. Slab Fork had not known it was making a songwriter, but it had given one everything he needed, and on a summer morning in 1972 the radio played it back. In the decades that followed, "Len on Me" became many things to many people. It became a graduation anthem and a funeral hymn. It became the song that communities sang when disaster struck and the song that families played at celebrations that had survived long enough to celebrate. It became, in the fullest sense that a song can become something, part of the shared cultural inheritance of an entire country, one of the small number of pieces of music that function as common property, belonging to everyone who has ever needed to say what it says. But in all of those uses, in all of those moments, in all of those millions of encounters between the song and the people who needed it, the song carried something that none of its listeners could fully see: the specific memory of a specific town. The coal-dusted streets of Slab Fork, the women who appeared with food after Clarence Withers died, the men from the mine who checked on the family, the particular, unremarkable, essential practice of a community that held its members together because holding together was the only viable strategy. None of this was visible in the song. It was not annotated, not explained, not offered to the listener as context. The song did not say this comes from West Virginia, from a coalfield community, from the specific experience of a boy who watched his neighbors practice solidarity without knowing they were practicing anything at all. It said only "lean on me. When you're not strong, I'll be your friend." But that simplicity, that apparent universality, was the product of something very specific. It had been distilled from the particular into the universal by a man who had lived inside the particular long enough to understand its essential nature, and who had the particular gifts of language and music to make that essence available to people who had never been to Slab Fork and never would be. The town gave him the truth. He gave the truth to the world, and the world receiving it had no idea where it had come from. That is how the most important things travel. Not announced, not attributed, not wearing the name of their origin. Simply present in the form of something that feels immediately and completely true, carrying the invisible weight of the specific place and specific people and specific years that made it possible. Slab Fork, West Virginia. Population small, legacy immeasurable. Just as I am, Bill Withers on what he always tried to be,